Hello, everybody. We are now going to have a lunchtime chat with Emily GREER, one of the co-founders of Kongregate, and she's going to talk about comparative stats between MMOs and social games. Take it away, Emily.
First of all, I want to apologize in advance that I'm just getting over bronchitis. So if I stop to cough or sniffle, I'm sorry about that, and I'm not contagious anymore. So that's the good news. What I'm planning to do in this talk is, so Kongregate is a platform for games. We have over 50,000 games, about 1,300 uploaded every month. And I want to talk about developers in particular, rarely get to see the stats of games other than their own. And we get a chance to see stats on a lot of different games. And so I want to provide some of the lessons that we've learned from comparing a lot of different games. So as I said, 50,000 games, 1,300 upload monthly. Most of those are single-player Flash games, very casual, but some of them are much deeper, multiplayer, MMOs, social games, et cetera, and that's mostly what I'm going to be talking about. We have 15 million monthly uniques, mostly English-speaking, but quite a few from Western Europe, particularly Northern Europe, and then Brazil, Russia, China, some other big gaming countries. We do a rev share with developers, and our revenue is a mix of ads and virtual goods. And I'm just going to be talking about virtual goods today. And we were acquired by GameStop in July 2010. So that was big news for us. Recently, GameStop is the largest games retailer in the world, but we're still running as an independent subsidiary. Creds are our virtual currency. It's very analogous to Facebook credits, except for we launched it first in 2008. It hooks into our account system, and it's the only way that you can buy virtual goods and games on Kongregate. We launched it late 2008, and as you can see, did almost absolutely nothing immediately. But it took off in 2009 when we started getting third-party MMOs and mail-oriented social games over from Facebook, which were games that had figured out how to monetize on their own and really connected with our audience, which is mostly male, 85% male, mostly young, mostly core gamers. We currently have 100 Cred games, and they're the majority of our revenue, which is pretty astonishing since we have 50,000 games that the majority is driven by just 100. And to give you, this talk isn't meant to be a sales pitch for Kongregate, though we are awesome, and we'd love to talk to you about that more later. But I want to give you a few stats about us to give context for the type of environment that Kongregate is. So as I said, everyone is a core gamer. Game developers generally report to us that their ARPUs are generally 60 to 100% higher on Kongregate than on Facebook or on other platforms. This is for core-oriented games. I don't think that would be true necessarily with a Farmville clone or something that was really meant for a female audience. One other thing we do is gamers look to us to tell them what the good games are, what games to play, so we can pump a critical mass of socially connected gamers into a game quickly. And with a lot of MMOs, multiplayer games, that is really important in terms of kind of kickstarting it. Achievements are very important on Kongregate. Our players are very much driven by collecting them. And when we put achievements on a game, it incents players far enough to get into the game to get addicted. And as I said, we promote the game, so there's no marketing cost for the developer. That also means that we're making our decisions based on how much we think players are going to like the game, and also how much we think that how well it's going to monetize. So we pay just as much attention to the stats of a game as the developer does. So what game genres are successful on Kongregate? Mostly in the virtual goods arena. They're mostly multiplayer. A few single-player games do pretty well. RPGs, collectible card games, strategy and empire building, tower defense, deathmatch, live PvP, sim, and management games. So, pretty wide variety, and there are both, successful games and failures in all the genres. So the genre alone doesn't make a success. So what does? The advantage of having a platform is that we have comparative stats. So same people, different games, who plays, how long, how much do they spend. And definitely common themes emerge from the most successful games. So before I jump into the stats, I want to give some background on how I'm calculating the stats, because most stats, there are a lot of different ways that you can calculate, and how you define a player drastically changes what your ARPUs are, what your stats are. So I'm going to tell you how I do it. It may not be exactly how you do it, but it gives the framework for what's going on. So everything that I'm going to be looking at now is stats that are lifetime for the game. We definitely look at things based on monthly, weekly, daily, revenue and such. But for a comparison's sake, lifetime is much more stable. I've also limited this analysis to just games that have been on our platform for 2 months, for at least 2 months, so that they've had time to fully bake. ARPU, average revenue per user. ARPU, average revenue per paying user. What we call a player is a registered user of Kongregate who loaded the game at least once. That doesn't mean that they interacted with the game. They might have just seen the loading screen and decided to jump away, but they loaded it, had a chance to look at it, and we call that a player. So for a Facebook game, it's very equivalent to an install. A reg is a player who's played the game at least 10 times. And an addict is a player who's played at least 50 times lifetime. Let's see. Okay, so first stat dump, and this is a big chart with a lot going on. So on the vertical axis is the average revenue per user. On the horizontal axis is the average spend per paying user. Each dot represents a game, and the size of the dot represents its total revenue. Because I don't want to sort of reveal anybody's stat, it's all anonymous. But if you're one of our developers and are curious which bubble you are, I'm happy to tell you later. As you can see, there's a pretty, if you're sort of familiar with looking at these kind of scatter charts, what you want to see is a pretty distinct line. And you can see that there is a pretty distinct line that shows a pretty strong correlation between the average revenue per user and the average spend. Not that this is shocking, but there's also a really wide range of the amount spent, going all the way up to $200, and then quite a few clustering, down in the $3 and $5 level. Some of the ones that are clustering really low are single-player games where there's just really limited amount of content available. But some of them are, multiplayer games that are trying to sell more and not effectively doing it. As you see, I did put one notation there, which is most of the games that have average revenues per paying user are MMOs that have come over from China and have really sort of perfected the art of whale curation. So I've been talking about, there's a clear line. There's also a clear set of outliers, a little bit lower, and that they have a lot of revenue. So I'm going to switch over to the next slide, which shows the same data essentially, but the horizontal axis is the percent of players who buy. And again, you see the outliers very clearly there on the right side. But the vast majority of games cluster right around 0.5% purchase rate, and their ARPU, and ARPU is really a factor of their ARPU. So let's just that's this. The high percent buyer reflects a broadly passionate audience. So generally takes pretty special games to get above that 1%. And I'd love to drill down and look at these games and tell you what it is that they've done right to make people that care that passionately that a lot of people will buy. Unfortunately, that's a lot hard. Figuring out how to do that is a lot harder and doesn't fit well into this talk. So I'm going to skip that and going to talk about how what different games do to end up with either high ARPUs or low ARPUs. And that still matters for even the games that have a high percent buyer. Their revenue is still, while always good, is still always a function of how much they can get people to spend on average. So to do that, I'm going to look at two games with similar ARPUs, number of players and revenue, but radically different ARPUs. So the high ARPU game that I'm going to look at has an average spend of 119 and a median of 16. The low ARPU game has an average spend of 24 and a median of 5. So this is, you can see a nice chart graph of the high ARPU game. And it's really driven by whales. 40% of the revenue comes from 2% of the players who are spending more than $1,000. 90% of the revenue is coming from players spending 100 plus, and the top whale has spent nearly $7,000. So very whale driven. Okay, here's the low ARPU game. Oddly enough, the pie charts look very similar. So the 54 in this game, even though the average is 24, 54% of the majority of revenue is coming from 5% of players spending more than $100. Only 9% of revenue is coming from the 65% of buyers who spent less than $10. The top whale has spent $1,000. So whale spending is smaller, but the revenue is still being dominated by a few high-paying players. And I can say broadly on Kongregate that for Kongregate overall, that's true too, where 1/3 of our revenue is being driven by only about 1% of our buyers. So now I'm coming to the sort of first lessons that we've drawn from this. Number one is make sure your players can spend $1,000. If you make a fun game, someone is going to want to spend an infinite amount, and you don't create a situation in which the spending is capped by availability or utility. If you look at that low ARPU game, that's really what's going on. There's no end of passion, but if you look at the game, it's hard to spend a whole lot more than $100 in a way that is really useful. There are a few high-value items that you can buy, and then there's an infinite amount of sort of small items that you can buy, but those don't really add a lot to the gameplay, and so their revenue per player is really limited by what is really useful to buy. The other lesson is don't underprice. We don't see a lot of price elasticity under $5. I mean, this is Western markets, so in poor countries, this might be the numbers might be different. But in general, I think the principle is still true that there's a lot of, unless you're in a situation like, say, the Apple Store, where everybody already has a stored credit card, it's truly one click. There's a lot of friction in the purchase, and it's an emotional decision in a virtual goods game where you don't really have to spend anything to decide to spend for progress and status. So focus on making people want to spend want progress, want status, and then they'll want to spend. I strongly recommend using intro paid currency to get people into the habit of purchase. If they have something in their wallet, sort of train them in the game to make that first purchase. That really helps. First-time buyer specials, things like that set the price high but then give them a discount. That also works well. And also setting your price high allows for sales and special events later. If you think about luxury goods, I think it's somewhat similar. You set Gucci creates this sense of something really valuable worth thousands, $2,000s of dollars, and then when you spend $500 at some sort of outlet mall to get the same thing, you both have that, you spent a really large amount, but you feel like you've gotten a deal. You've bought into that higher price point, and you're both you're excited about what you've gotten for your money, even though it might not really be worth that. So now I'm going to skip to a different topic, which is how we look at retention, because retention is a really important factor in game monetization. And we do it, I think, a little bit differently than other people, partly because we sort of developed our stats on our own, and partly based on what was convenient to get, but then I've become pretty attached to them. So most people that I hear about look at retention based on time. So how many people return in 24 hours, how many people return in 7 days, how many people return in 30 days. That's good, and we do that too, but I feel like there's some problems with that. One is that doesn't really capture the intensity in which people are coming back. If they come back once a day versus 3 times a day, that's a different player. Also, also, to find out your 30-day stats, you have to wait 30 days, which is a long time, and I'm impatient. And so we look at it we focus most on plays. So we look at percent repeat. So what percent of players ever return, and that really shows the initial impressions and interest in the game. Repeat to reg, so what percent of players who repeat become regulars? And to remind you, that's people who played at least twice, what percent of them become regulars? And it's a ratio, and by looking at it as a ratio, you isolate the secondary effect from the first one. So this really shows how strongly is the player hooked in the early to middle parts of the game. And then my favorite stat, which is the reg to addict stat, which is what percent of regulars become addicts. And this really shows and isolates the engagement of end game content and how well you're getting people to that point, and how engaging it is. So let's look at some numbers. So this is the percent repeat on the horizontal axis, ARPU again on the vertical axis. And you can see that it's a big old blob, and the number of people who come back to your game doesn't really say anything about what your average revenue per user is going to be. It does say something about what your total revenue is, and that's because the percent of people who repeat correlates really strongly with rating and viral spread, how much they're talking about your game, how much they love your game, how quickly they get in. But it actually doesn't mean quite as much as this chart makes it look like, because whenever we put achievements on a game, that automatically raises the percent of people who repeat by about 10 points. So if you look at the people above 50%, that's mostly games that we've put achievements on and heavily promoted, so yes, they have more revenue. But if you look at the left hand of the chart, you can see that generally having a better repeat rate leads to higher revenue. And so yes, it's important to focus on the initial parts of your game, but that doesn't only tells a small part of the monetization story. So this is why my regs to addicts is my favorite stat. And that's because it correlates really, really, really strongly with both ARPU and monetization. That's a very, for a scatter plot, that's a very straight line. And a lot of the ones that you see that are kind of hovering at the lower parts of that, those are actually newer games where the revenue hasn't caught up to the stats. And those bubbles are going to get bigger over time and look more like the other ones. So, and regs to addicts really shows the end game. So this is the most important lesson from this talk and the thing that we focus on with developers most. Look to the end game first. That's the single thing that is going to allow you to monetize your game the most. Every high ARPU and a high revenue game on Kongregate has a strongly social and competitive end game. And there's no exceptions to that. Even nobody in the top 20, every game in the top 20 has this to some degree. Some common features, and there's a mix and match of this. Guilds and leagues, guild warfare, leaderboards, PvP, either synchronous or asynchronous. We haven't, synchronous is harder, and we see less of it, and we don't see that it makes a big difference. Visible status and character progression, and then guilds and leagues. And I'm saying that twice on purpose because it's the single best thing you can do from our perspective. So guilds allow in-game communities to form and apply pressure both for the players to return and to spend. And you'll sometimes see whales in a guild buy things for their whole guild. And somebody who's not keeping up with their guild will spend money to compensate for a lack of time. So there's a lot of dynamics there that are powerful. So one game in which it's been powerful is Dream World, which is a RPG that came over from Facebook, but has done better on Kongregate than on Facebook, actually. Only 13% of non-buyers are in guilds, but 80% of buyers are. And guilds have, members of guilds have 3 times the retention. Another example is War Metal Tyrant, which is a collectible card game that was also developed for Facebook, also came over and also has done better on Kongregate. 6% of users are in factions, but 41% of paying users are in factions. And the ARPU for non-faction members is 19 cents versus $3.87 for faction members. So just a huge, huge difference. But stats can be beaten. That's not, what the stats of your game aren't the only thing that matter. And this is something actually that if you saw the Big Points presentation right before mine, that they also mentioned, that you need to keep feeding your players. Regular updates, new features, events yield greater engagement and reduce fatigue, and sales and specials can offer significant jumps in revenue. I'm showing this chart again, which is the exact same one because I wanted to show you the bubbles. I'm going to be talking about one of the really, really big bubbles up in the left, or middle right, and one of the medium-sized bundles in the right. So both good games, and both have done well. So this is the weekly revenue of one of those games. You can see it launched, we put it on the homepage and it had a nice spike. We added achievements and featured it. I got another nice spike. And then it started trending down. We're able to do a special item promotion about 6 months later. And then they had a new version, about another 6 months later. And the game just really trailed off. Those things, the events weren't close enough together, and it lost momentum. Also, this game, as a special note, has a relatively harsh policy about accounts, and accounts get deleted after a certain amount of time, a couple of months or so. So it makes it hard to reactivate players, and I think that in that situation, the frequency of updates was particularly important. Now here's another game that launched about the same time. I had a slower initial launch, but similar pattern, but just was updating the game sometimes twice a week, at least every week. There's minor content updates all the time. I'm planning out some major content updates and Labor Day and events. Some of these we promoted. I know we promoted the Labor Day event and the Christmas update. Some of these spikes, we just saw a huge spike in revenue and had to ask the developer what happened. And he had done, completely with his current and existing user base, not even bothering to relapse, just drove huge spikes. Anyway, I didn't mean to quite move that fast, but anyway, so the lesson from that is that just keep working on it, keep feeding it, and just because something launches well doesn't mean it's gonna that it can keep going without feeding. And even with a weaker launch, you can really, really build your game. And then that's it. This is a shorter version of a 30-minute version of longer talk that I'm going to be doing with someone else from Kongregate at GDC. So if you're interested in another 30 minutes of this, including some in-depth analysis of games, please attend that as well. And if you're interested in working with us, learn more about working with Kongregate, we've got case studies, API information, also, and business case stuff at dev@kongregate.com, or you can contact us at apps@kongregate.com, or you can talk to us after the talk. My colleague David Chu is also here. So that's it. If there are any questions. Didn't say anything controversial? No one's pissed off? Sure.
These two examples, what kind of games were they?
Let's see, one was a strategy MMO, and one is a social RPG.
And which was which?
So the strategy MMO was the less happy one, and the social RPG is the happier one.
And both clients?
No, all of our games are browser based. Yeah, we have a couple of games that we're experimenting with using Java applets, but were initially installed but then played in the browser. But everything else is browser based. Most of the games are Flash on our site, but we also accept Unity, Java, HTML5, and then most virtual goods games are done via iframe and to the developer server. So.
And another question. Probably you can also. I sit around a lot of times. League of Legends did a wonderful job, I think, by doing one thing. Every gameplay item you have two different currencies. So they have an in-game currency, a real money currency. But most of the browser games, Facebook games, mobile games, a lot of them use for one item just in-game, one item just real money currency. But why do you think that is?
So Jill is asking me to repeat the question, which is, so League of Legends has all items available in a dual currency, both the in-game currency and the paid currency, whereas most browser games have it only available in one or the other. I'd say I haven't inspected every single game on our site to say some do a mix, and some do one or the other. I think since I don't know the mind of all the developers, I can't really answer that question. I'm mostly analyzing based on what we see and not based on decisions. I think some of that has to do with situations where there's trading in the economy, and they like to keep certain valuable items for paid only. But I wish I were the right person to ask, and I'm really not. So I'm just giving you a terrible non-answer. I'm sorry. So,
can you tell us more about Kongregate creds? Is it a requirement for the platform? What are the pros and cons?
Yes. So Kongregate creds, the question was to tell more about Kongregate creds, and is there a requirement for a platform, and what are the pros and cons? So the answer is it is a requirement for the platform. We feel that we have a very trusted relationship with our players. Our average registered user plays 40 games a month, and comes back, is tremendously engaged. And we feel that by having one currency that they can use and one wallet, that they are going to be more comfortable purchasing from us than from a sort of essentially a random game developer. It's in a trusted environment, a site that they've built up history with. Also means that we can have sort of a unified payment flow and have a lot of different payment types. As a negative, it also means that if you have a built-up currency, you can use it in multiple games, and we do see that the average purchaser spends in about average person who has spent at all has spent in 3 games. So people move from game to game, and a whale in one game is likely to be a whale in another. So that's a positive, in that we're building up a history, we're building up stored credit cards, we're building up stored PayPal accounts, and trust with the developers. As a negative, if you're charging directly, then you get to keep all the money, and by having it controlled through us, then we take part of it. From our point of view, it's sort of all positive. From game developer, there's a mix. It's an integration, but by reducing the friction to payment and reducing the friction to payment and reducing any sort of distrust issues, we're making the payment overall easier. We also the standard revenue share with developers is 70-30 gross, and we're absorbing all of the payment costs into our side of that 30. So in the case of mobile payments, for example, we are only ever really breaking even because it's most carriers are taking more than 30%. In some countries, it's as much as 80%. So in that case, we're essentially doing a favor. We work it out so that we're never losing money, but we're also not making money. That's there more as a player convenience. Also, by having the one system, we get a chance to do what you've just seen, which is compare stats across a lot of games and sort of drill in and see what matters, and then go back to the game developer and give them advice on what's working in their game, what's not. And we treat all of our game developers as partners. The success of their game is also our success, so we work very closely with them to optimize and enhance their games. So also we do do the fraud modeling, so which is also possible because of that. So you have a question?
I don't know if it's on. Can you turn this on? All right, I'll just scream.
Okay.
So my question is, you mentioned that you have 50 million users on Kongregate. It seems that most users will stay and play several of the games available. So what are you guys doing in terms of expanding the user base? Like, are you going to double it, and if so, how?
We want to double it. That is our goal. We definitely don't feel that we have reached our potential. In the sort of early history of Kongregate, most of our revenue came from ads, and in a situation like that, it's a very tricky arbitrage business to buy ads to sell ads. So all of our traffic was organic, people linking to games, search engine traffic, and that's still and people returning word of mouth. That's still the majority of our traffic, but as our virtual goods business have grown, the economics have changed very drastically, where we're now investing in paid marketing in all sorts of forms. And because we both drive drive players immediately to games that monetize, but we also have opportunities to drive them to one of the other 50,000 games. However we think makes sense to match them, we have opportunities in terms of marketing and paid marketing that are not necessarily available to the average game developer. We're also our parent company GameStop has half a billion visits in their stores in any given year, and these are the corest of core players, and the average spend, the amount that they spend on console games is very huge. So we're working very closely with them to take advantage of that, that both their database, their loyalty members, and in-store promotions. We find that GameStop customers coming over to Kongregate are worth 6 times the average of our new customers, so that's something that's very valuable to us. We're also looking at localization into more languages. Currently we're English speaking, but are still popular in a lot of countries that are non-English speaking, and we're looking at localizing into the native languages as a sort of very natural expansion.
One thing I would like to add is that we may not have 850 million players on Facebook, but all the people that come to Kongregate are there to play games and socialize while playing games. So they're not there to upload pictures or update their status 10 times a day. They're there to play games, and they're very willing to spend money on games. So it's not like there's no cost to use our acquisition. If the game is good, if it retains users and makes money, we can drive a lot of users to it. You have to compete for eyeballs.
Yeah. Sorry. Any more questions?
In the MMOs or in most social games, there are obviously players who create multiple accounts. And these multiple accounts could significantly impact the way you calculate all your stats. So is there any way you can do to make these type of accounts out of the equation?
Yes, we have an internal algorithm that tracks alts and excludes them. So we do that. No, because if we share it, then the players will start evading it. So it involves the way we track site visitors and how they log in, and sort of a combination of cookies plus some other things. There's another.
Do you see a relation between your demographics and the spending? Because you percent, like the whales are a small percentage, obviously.
Yeah.
I would doubt that overwhelmingly 15-year-olds pay $1,000.
No, they don't. So the average age of the buyer is 26 versus the 21 for the site. For a whale, it is in the, for our sort of top tier whale, it's in the high 30s. For our sort of more broad-based, spent 500 or more, it's in the low 30s. So definitely as you go older, it gets better. Our U.S., they are largely from the U.S., but from a lot of other countries. Our single top whale is actually from Germany, but closely fighting it out with a CPA from the U.S. So when they've spent that much, we get to know them. So in general, we see that, and I think this is sort of relatively broadly known, that there's when it comes to ads, there's a huge difference between the U.S. and other markets. When it comes to virtual goods, there is much less of a difference, and some countries in Western Europe are actually exceed the U.S. in terms of average spend per user, which is one of the reasons why we're looking at localizing.
Yes, you mentioned that MMOs originated from China, did very well, and you commented that they had perfected the art of value creation, very good at it. Could you expand on that observation?
I'd say that they're very good at the art of whale creation. What we see in the stats of the games coming over from MMO of Chinese MMOs is that they turn a lot of players off very quickly, and you'll see if you looked at that percent repeat stat with big bubbles, that's happening with a lot of the Asian games. I think in large part this is because a lot of them are sort of clones of each other, and once a player has decided that they've played one, they've played Caesarea, they've played Evany, then they've played this genre and they don't want to play it again. So I think that is one factor, but they're also fairly intense. But what they're really good at is creating competitive guild environments, and and also shamelessly charging large amounts for things. So Western developers are rarely comfortable putting $1,000 price tag on an item, but that's not uncommon in a Chinese MMO. So I think there's just a very different level of comfort with pricing high amongst Chinese developers, and I think that is and extracting money, where I think a lot of Western developers are still a little bit more squeamish about really squeezing things. There's a game on our site called Rich State that has in-game achievements that you can only has an in-game achievement for spending $10. That's something that I think would be a little inconceivable to a Western developer, to just give an achievement for spending money.
How do the Western audience react to that kind of games? Because I mean that's exactly the point. Everyone thinks about, they do it, I would hate it to play, but how is it?
I'd say that game has a very low turns a lot of players off, but the players that it keeps spend a lot of money. So they do slightly above average on Kongregate. I'd say the larger problem for us with games coming over from China is the frequency of updates. A lot of times the licensed English versions are not coming from the game developers. They don't really control the code, and they can do occasional events, but they can't update the content, and that limits I think that's a greater limit on their success than their pricing model. Any more questions?
I've got one.
Okay.
So I know that sponsorship is a big part of your strategy. Do you see any correlation between sponsored games and high spending users from those specific games?
We do, based on the genre of the game. Okay, sorry. So Joe was asking us about sponsorship, which is actually one of the marketing ways that we acquire users, which is essentially we buy, before a single-player Flash game is released, we buy the rights to include the Kongregate brand and a link to Kongregate within the game. And this is probably the single biggest source of revenue for single-player Flash game developers. And we do see, based on the type of single-player game, very big differences in the lifetime value of the player. So someone who likes a core RPG type sponsorship game is likely to come on and spend a lot of money on virtual goods. Somebody who likes a very casual puzzle game is much less likely to. Now, some of that may have to do with audience match, and if we found a great monetizing puzzle game, then those players might spend just as well. And I would love to see more variety in the types of virtual goods games, and I would love to see a great virtual goods based puzzle game. I haven't seen that yet. We haven't seen that, but as a puzzle game player myself, I would like that.